thanks for the introduction. I'm Mark Nicholson. I'm one of the founders and CEO of Vivacity Labs. We've been asked to come in and support some of this exploration of the new shape of travel, looking in particular at the active travel component, thinking about cycling and walking and how those have evolved over the past few months or year. So first, in terms of where this data actually comes from. So as a company, we use video analytics to gather data about what's happening on the roads. So super short video just to get people into the right mindset. We understand what different road users are, how they move through the road environment, and crucially, that includes cyclists and pedestrians, as well as all kinds of different modes of traffic. So we have a detailed data set from every sensor that we have across the country. These sensors look like this. They're little sort of boxes about the size of an A4 sheet of paper posted on lamp columns. And for this analysis, we've used around 440 data feeds from across the country, from lots of different local authorities, and combined those into a single aggregated data set, which we've been sharing with the DFT and TTF, and looking at some of our own analysis to understand what's happening across the country. So what does that show? I don't think it's going to come as any surprise that the overall picture showed the couple of lockdowns. The key thing I wanted to flag on this slide is the weekly variation. There is a huge difference, particularly shown in our data set between weekends and weekdays. So what I'll show for the rest of the presentation is indexed by day of week to eliminate some of those variations. So once you do that indexing, you get back to this slightly smoother data set. And unsurprisingly, you've got the first lockdown, you've got the second and third lockdowns. For the rest of this presentation, I'm treating September as the peak, as the closest to the new normal that we can. So that's the data set I'm really going to focus on in terms of understanding what does the future look like from here. And then we can see the little peak that Leanne mentioned earlier in terms of just before the last November lockdown, Boris announcing it did cause a substantial spike in traffic in our data across the country. So using that as a baseline, what can we actually see about first pedestrians? I'll come on to cyclists in a minute. So my first observation is that the pedestrian data is much spikier than the other data sets. So this is still with the indexing by day of week. So actually what we see is that the weekdays are substantially below the level of car traffic, but weekends spiked and followed very closely with exactly what was happening with cars. So the assumption here is that people are staying off the high street, they're staying at home much more for their leisure activities during the week, but actually at weekends they're broadly following their normal working trends. So there's a big difference between the way that people are behaving weekdays versus weekends during lockdown. This isn't a pre-lockdown phenomenon, this is a difference caused by lockdowns. We try to explore that in a bit more detail and look at what happens by time of day. Pre-lockdown, and this the sort of light blue at the top, you see three different peaks: a morning peak, a lunchtime peak, and an evening peak. As we saw in the car data, the moment you go into lockdown, so looking at that first March to May period, all three peaks are strongly suppressed. We've seen a gradual recovery through to September, but the peaks are returning last. The inter-peak periods are returning much more strongly than the peaks. So ongoing lockdowns are suppressing peaks, not just in car traffic, as we saw earlier, but also in pedestrians. Then I wanted to explore briefly what the impact of the school opening was on that. And actually, I thought there were some really interesting insights from this. If you look at what happened in August, late August, there was no morning peak, and evening peak was also strongly suppressed. You did see a peak at lunchtime, but the shoulders were gone. Whereas by the time you got to mid-September, just a couple of weeks later, not much change in aggregate virus figures or lockdowns. You've seen a huge bounce in both peaks. And crucially, this wasn't just the times that schools opened, so 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. Actually, the evening peak rose substantially at 5 and 6 p.m. Unclear whether that is students or secondary school students wandering around after school, whether it's parents being more free to use their evenings and go out. But there was a substantial difference in the way that peak worked as a result of schools. So we thought that was quite an interesting insight into the way that this peak dynamic is operating. Moving on to talk about cyclists. As we've already seen, the cycling numbers have spiked substantially during lockdown. And I suppose what's interesting to me here is that it's somewhat similar to pedestrians, but much, much higher. You see a huge difference between weekend and weekdays, and actually the weekday sort of almost slightly more commuter cycling is at similar levels to cars, whereas weekends are substantially elevated. Leanne mentioned that this was very weather dependent on the wet weekends. Actually, the same is true at the very sunny weekends. So you may remember that we had a heat wave in May. You see some of the highest peaks on cycling on those super hot weekends in the early summer last year. We've done a little bit more analysis on this that people are very happy to talk about later, where we've seen reductions in overall cycling volumes by about between 40 and 80% on rainy days, and increases of 10 to 20% on very sunny days. So there's a clear correlation between cycling and weather, as you might expect. Looking at different cities now, so Steve mentioned earlier that Warrington had seen a substantial increase in cycling. We see interesting variations between cities. So what this graph shows, each little dot is a city, and we've got on the x-axis the mode share of cycling pre-lockdown. Now, these are a different kind of mode share to those that you might be used to seeing. This is a mode shared by the number of road users we see, which is a better proxy for mode share by distance rather than by trips. So all these numbers will be lower for cyclists than you would normally expect to see. Nevertheless, there is a clear variation in cities. The two on the right are Oxford and Cambridge, as you might expect, very cycling-centric cities, whereas you've got most other places that we've analysed in this study on the left. And the y-axis is looking at the increases in cycling during lockdown. And so what we see is the places that had less cycling before saw a much, much higher percentage increase at least, whereas the places that were already very cycling heavy, they were broadly similar to the baseline. That's just over 100% cycling that is broadly indexed to what was there before. So at the weekends, we see this huge increase primarily in places that did not have much cycling before. Looking at weekdays, you see a substantial decrease in places like Oxford and Cambridge as the commuter cycling that is very prevalent there gets suppressed, whereas in places with much less commuter cycling, cycling during the week was much less heavily impacted. So all of this sort of feeds into a picture of actually cycling is more nuanced than just a headline number. There are lots of different components to that cycling, and those are sort of showing through in data in different cities. A very reasonable question to ask would be, given I was just talking about Oxford and Cambridge, they're very student-heavy cities, how does any of this vary with time? We actually didn't see a big jump in cycling after the return to university back in the autumn term last year. So I don't think that a lot of this is driven purely by students. I'm sure they'll have an impact, but there are trends that run deeper than the student population. Finally, just looking into the times of day for cyclists. So pre-lockdown, we saw huge peaks at 9 AM, and the evening peak was a little bit more spread out. As we've seen in all the other data sets, that was hugely suppressed in early lockdown, been gradually recovering, but again, the inter-peak has recovered much more strongly than the peak. And so by September, the inter-peak numbers were only 10 or 20% below pre-lockdown, whereas the peaks were down more like 40%. Looking at that through the lens of school opening, you see a very similar trend to that you saw with pedestrians, where cyclists are a major component of the peak, or sorry, schools are a major component of the cycling peak. The difference between late August and mid-September in terms of the number of cyclists was very pronounced. So lots of school cyclists coming back in, but if we revisit this overall graph with that in mind, September is still way below the pre-lockdown numbers. So lots of peak cyclists that are not school related, but some that clearly are. So in summary, a couple of key lessons from my perspective. One, pedestrians are really, really strongly down during the week, much more strongly than at the weekend, even when the restrictions were being relaxed back in September. The schools have a significant impact on peaks for both pedestrians and cyclists. That's not just restricted to the 8 AM and 3 PM rush, but they actually seem to have knock-on effects to the sort of broader concept of rush hour. And finally, the leisure cycling has really blossomed during the pandemic, while commuter cycling is still suppressed. And that's it for me. Thanks very much.